Buenos días a todas, a todos, bienvenidas, bienvenidos a este espacio, a esta conversación.
She just said a few words in her indigenous language. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this interactive session between Canada and Mexico. I would like to make a few housekeeping announcements before we begin. And I would like to ask you or remind you that if you need interpretation services, you can access them on the bottom of your screen, where you'll see an icon with a little world, and there you can select the language you wish to listen to during this conversation. And you can also follow this conversation on our social media with the hashtag ExchangeKMX and also Intercambios AMX. She just wrote that down on the chat. And we'll also have an opportunity to have Q&A. Zoom allows us to have direct contact with our panelists in that sense, so that we don't lose any of your comments. So you can use that option to write down your questions in the Q&A segment. We would also like to invite you to remember that if you are going to share on social media, that you include all of the institutions. You mentioned them all. I would now like to welcome Chantal Chastanet, who is the Minister Counselor for the Canadian Embassy here in Mexico. She'll be welcoming us. Thank you. Thank you to our moderator, Taheo Diaz-Robles. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning. Once again, I'd like to thank you for joining us at this second exchange between activists in Mexico and Canada to talk about and create new proposals regarding the use of digital tools to revitalize Indigenous languages. I would also like to thank Frédéric Vacheron, who is a representative of the UNESCO in Mexico, for joining us, and of course the panelists, who are J.C. Firth-Hagen, Isela Shospa, Ian McCullum, and Kenneth Yanis Ortiz, who will help us with this session. In the previous session, we had 150 participants on average, and participants from 33 different countries, which is an example of the potential that digital tools can offer us to help us with the revitalization of Indigenous languages. The Los Pinos Declaration for the Decade of Indigenous Languages, which was published by the UNESCO a couple of weeks ago, is a roadmap which refers to the crucial value that digital tools will have in the future to strengthen the role of Indigenous languages over the next few years. Technological infrastructure, knowledge repositories, teaching materials, and above all, training in the use of these tools are just some of the more important points included in that declaration, and that will be discussed today by our specialists. Today, more than ever, within the context of this global pandemic, we've realized the possibilities of offering these tools, but we've also seen how Indigenous languages are underrepresented, and access to these technologies is not available to everybody, which is why the Pinos Declaration is a fundamental document to increase our efforts and to reconfirm the commitment that we have with our Indigenous peoples. I would like to conclude by once again, thank you for coming. We will be very interested in hearing what you have to say, and we hope that this space that we're placing at your disposal in combination with Rising Voices will help us to encourage dialogue and an exchange of efforts that can be undertaken for our indigenous languages in both our countries. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chantal. Now I would like to hand the floor to Frédéric Vacheron. He is the representative of the UNESCO here in Mexico. Good morning, and thank you very much. I would like to thank Chantal Chastenet, as well as Ernesto Miranda from the Canadian Embassy here in Mexico, as well as the representative of Rising Voices, Eddie, for helping us with this. Thank you all for organizing this space in which we can talk about the crucial role that digital media and social media can play in order to revitalize and increase the dynamism of our indigenous languages, not just for Mexico and Canada, but also for the almost 7,000 indigenous languages globally. It's obvious that the new technologies are important, especially in terms of helping us to have more access to social, economic, and cultural spaces. It's an important indicator of our well-being. A lot has been said about this, and as Chantal was saying, there's not much more I would like to add, but I would like to mention the fact that it's important to acknowledge and back the principle of universal access to internet as a means to promote the exercise of our human rights, especially Article 19 from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the right to freedom of expression and the freedom to participate in scientific and cultural life. I believe that those two rights are very important, and it's the right that any person, any people has to express themselves in the language of their choosing and to participate in cultural life. Specifically to that point, it's not just access to these, which is why it's so important that we also refer to the possibility of expressing ourselves, communicating, and to freely creating. And this is a public effort that we have to make. And I think that it should be considered as something that is of public interest to guarantee that we can all express ourselves under equal conditions. Another point that perhaps we often forget to mention is the need to accompany that access to internet with an educational strategy, both formal and informal education strategy, and to understand that education enables us. It enables us to have these rights. It enables us to have access to internet. Here I'm talking about digital literacy, but beyond that, there's another point that we rarely mention, but we have to touch upon all the time, is the involvement of the media. We have to be able to read those means of communication and to be able to read that content with a critical eye so that the users and producers can be in the conditions to be able to exercise their right to free expression. Without that, obviously, we won't truly have freedom of expression. And so in that sense, I think it's important that we have to create that critical spirit so that we can be able to handle all that information that we have available. For example, we know that on the internet, there are a lot of videos that talk about climate change, and they are many more than those who go against the whole idea of climate change. And it's important to be able to have that available to us because it will help to strengthen all of our indigenous cultures. The Lakota wisdom, which is a indigenous people in Canada, they believe that the world is a circle and that there's nobody behind you, nobody in front of you, nobody on top of you, nobody below you. It's a sacred circle, and it's been defined as such in order to create a sense of unity amongst us all. I would like to congratulate you on the organization of this event, and we should remember that the production of all of these types of materials shows that we believe that all cultures have an equal footing, and it reminds us that we have to be able to protect the cultural expressions of all our countries. It was a statement, a declaration that was issued in 2005, and both Canada and Mexico have signed on to that declaration. Mexico and Canada were the first countries to promote that idea, and they have focused on protecting their indigenous cultures. Perhaps in the past, we haven't done things properly, but now we're learning and we're understanding the importance of linguistic diversity by creating new types of forms to do so in the media, in forms of communication. And that's important for us to be able to grow globally as well as to express ourselves culturally. Ms. Chastanet referred to the Pinos Declaration. It was an event that was held in February of this year, at which the representative of the UNESCO was present. And it was the first international act that was held in that cultural center since it was first opened. It was interesting to see that it was the first international event and one in which they spoke about the importance of indigenous languages. A decade sounds like a lot, but it also might not be enough. It's important to bear in mind that considering all of the problems that we've had over the millennia in the past, we know that the indigenous languages speakers are fully aware of what they need. This decade will begin shortly, and we need to have the necessary instruments to be able to reach our goals for that decade. I think that Mexico, UNESCO, and Canada can work together so that we can make sure that we take full advantage of this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Frederick.
Thank you, Frederic.
Vamos a iniciar con nuestro
Now let's begin with our panel session with this conversation by first referring to this declaration which was issued at Los Pinos
realza esta idea y
and
nos
which speaks of this idea, which is a key idea. I think it should be the cornerstone of the decade to come, which has the saying, nothing for us without us. I think that's an important phrase because it's key that we understand that these types of conversations should be taking place between the speakers or the no longer speakers of our languages, indigenous languages, because of discrimination or systems that have excluded us, that therefore we no longer speak our language, and which is why we have to reclaim our right to be able to express ourselves in our languages. It's not just a cultural right, it's not just something that is because of customs and traditions. We have a right as indigenous peoples that live on this planet to express ourselves in our own languages. I would like to welcome JC, Ian, Jenner, Isela Shospa to this conversation, and I'm very pleased to be able to be a part of this conversation and to be able to hand you the floor. We're going to have a conversation divided into 3 segments. Initially, we'll be asking you to tell us a little bit about your work, and I'll be posing a question to each one of you each time. In the second round, we'll be talking about the subject at hand, which is this decade of indigenous languages. And at the end, we'll be taking an overview of the Q&As, rather the questions that might have been written in that segment of Q&A. And I would also like to take this opportunity to invite you all to use that Q&A box if you have any questions that you'd like to pose during any of the panelists' presentations. And that way, each one of those panelists can take a look at them and maybe they can find a way to comment on them in their own comments. Let's begin with Ian McCollum. He is a professor of the Munsee language in Canada. And I'd like to ask Ian the following question, because he's developing online platforms in order to be able to teach his language. He has also been working on social media to find fun ways to teach the language and to express themselves in their own language. And he's been working with different types of institutions and organizations to strike up partnerships to revitalize languages, which is fundamental to our cause. So Ian, I have the following question. How can we strengthen the processes of Indigenous languages learning in online platforms, and how can we partner with educational organizations as well as others? You have the floor, Ian.
Thank you, Anishik. Quinganao Alomo Wamawan, Nidashinzi Ian McCallum, Ninon Jai Nalahi, Ndalangamau Takwa. My name is Ian McCallum. I'm from the Munsee, Delaware First Nation, which is a small community in southwestern Ontario here in Canada. And I follow the ways of the turtle. A little bit of background before I answer the questions. My language, my mother's language, the Munsee language, is spoken by about no more than 100 second language speakers, and we only have a single first language speaker remaining. So it would be a language that would be designated very critical in terms of its success and its support over the ensuing decade for international or Indigenous languages. To get to the question though, in terms of the work that I've been doing, how can the teaching process of Indigenous languages on digital platforms be strengthened? When working with the Munsee language, consistency and scheduling have been very critical in terms of maintaining the two classes that we use, or that we have using the Zoom platform. We have a third class which will be initiated for the month of August. But also that wraparound support of following up with emails and offering support for the learners during the week. We've tried to maintain the learning approach that would be experienced in our face-to-face sessions. With the cancellation of face-to-face sessions as of March the 14th. We've tried to embody that same methods that we would have done in our face-to-face sessions with laughter, learning from the land, building that trust, and also that comfort with material with the participants in an online format. We've tried to offer the learning based on off the land. We've clearly tried to identify the learning goals for all and incorporate the best practices for second language learning. We've tried to put in support materials, so we've extended ourselves just off Zoom into the world of YouTube and Twitter as well to build vocabulary. And we are looking towards the best practices for language learning, which would be an immersion type format, which is the master apprentice format. We're also mindful of the fact of fatigue, so Zoom fatigue, online learning fatigue, and with a limited number of Munsee language speakers who are proficient in order to teach, also taxing a very small group of people who can provide that service. Critical, and this is a piece that we're really looking into, is making sure that culture and history is woven into the language as well. So far, it has been very much learning from the land, which has certain pieces of that, but also acknowledging our rich history as Munsee people and the culture therein as well. We look for ideas from other First Nation groups in Canada who are in a similar situation as we are in terms of having low numbers of speakers, but are very vibrant on social media and also in terms of offering different possibilities over the internet. What potential is there to involve digital activism in alliances with public institutions and other organizations? The two opinions that we struggle with daily is that when we offer a program, it is taken up with extreme excitement that, wow, I can access this language over the web. From a community standpoint, we get a lot of, well, the language will always be there, so I'll access it when I can. So the ability to offer the language over the web has allowed us to touch base with a lot of people from all over the world. A lot of family members who have needed to move to the city or have moved across country or still live in the United States have been able to access the language. Digital activism allows for the awareness of, global awareness of languages that are threatened, like the Munsee language. Here in Ontario, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee languages, and the Cree language, Oji Cree, have many speakers compared to the Munsee language. Without that exposure through digital activism, the Munsee language would be not forgotten, but it wouldn't have that same level playing field. We have the ability to reach out to our off-reserve membership, which is myself included, so people can access the language. Through institutions, now K-12 students within school boards can access the language over the web. It allows us then to offer programs through universities and colleges as well, or at least to promote and to push universities and colleges to offer face-to-face programming or online programming. We can offer it at friendship centers, which is usually an urban facility where Indigenous people can gather for services. We can offer those programs because now the message is coming out that there are people to support the language, there are materials to support the language. And to give you an idea, without digital activism and the support of, when we offered face-to-face programmings for language on the reserve, on the Munsee Delaware community, there'd be roughly about 30 people who would show up for weekends. But with the support of digital activism and offering online, we've now doubled and almost tripled the numbers of people who access the language during our 2 sessions, and we're looking forward to expanding that for the 3rd. We hope to inspire students. We want to maintain those connections that students have with their language, but most importantly, it connects family. It connects family that has been spread all over Canada and the United States, and they get to connect with rich pieces of their culture, connect with family, and of course, connect with the language. Anishik, thank you.
Muchas gracias, Aneshik Ian.
Thank you, Anishik Ian. Thank you for sharing that reality, which I believe hundreds of languages, if not more languages, share, in the sense that there are speakers. There are many languages that are being silenced because there are not enough speakers around, and that's something that we have to work on. It's alarming to hear the news that we get from different parts of the world in which we hear about the death of these guardians of our languages. And so the few of us that are left have to be very careful. And we're losing a lot of our first Indigenous language speakers. And so these types of events are so important for us to help us with our efforts. Now I'd like to grant the floor to Isela Shospa. She's an independent publisher. She's Nawa from Milpa Alta. And based on her experience as a publisher, because I've had an opportunity of getting to know her, she's been able to see and to help encourage encourage an increased availability of audiovisual material, especially illustrations. Content is very important, but we also have to make sure that that content is sustainable and not just be something that is the thrill of the moment. So my question here is, what are the main needs that you feel have to be covered to encourage the training and the development of Indigenous digital graphic designers and to encourage the creation of content? She's speaking Nahuatl. Good morning, everybody. My name is Isela Shospa, and I'm from the Círculo de Cerros, also known as Milpa Alta, which is in the southeastern part of Mexico City. And what I do is I illustrate children's books in Indigenous languages. And so, as Tajeu just said, with regard to the thrill that we have in using internet to develop content, I think it's true that access to tools is very important, but beyond that, we have to be able to control what we write, because remember that reading and writing have made us powerful. And there's a segment, a privileged segment of our cultures in which we've seen that there are privilege hierarchies in which lower class or indigenous communities don't have as much access to information, and they're being excluded. And this is something that is oftentimes increasing because they oftentimes provide us with information that many people do not have access to. There are problems with access to information, with the possibility of listening to new voices, because there has been a corporate control of access to knowledge. And in that sense, we've lost our voice. And so this excitement that we have now should not overshadow the fact that we don't have control over the content. All we do is consume and read those things that others believe that we should listen to. In that sense, for indigenous languages, we're seeing the dismantling of our traditional circles by these means. And that is something that we can overcome. And so the ability to take part in this whole new process is wonderful. There are a lot of content creators that are of indigenous heritage. And although it might seem odd, finally, after hundreds of years, we've earned the right to show people that it's not difficult to learn our indigenous languages, that it can be done. They allowed us to speak up, to use the tools that are available to us on internet to be able to create our own content. But we shouldn't forget that the internet is a tool that is oftentimes just available to the privileged. Apps are oftentimes still luxuries for many people. And so this is a process that is progressing, and that we are at a serious advantage as indigenous peoples in terms of our digital literacy and in terms of our access to media as indigenous peoples. Reading and writing, if we can read and write, we have the power. A lot of young artists are now trying to see how they can express themselves in digital media. Sometimes there are people that have been very successful in this effort and they've progressed a lot, but there are others who are more fragile. But at least they're there, they're trying. And so we have to take advantage of the fact that they're looking into this possibility so that we can train people and make people realize that this is available to them. The internet and all of its applications are tools, though. We have to remember that. They're tools that are available to us, but they're not the end of what we want to do. It's a means to achieve our goals, and that's something that we should never lose sight of. Another one of the points that I wanted to mention with regard to the content that is being created with regard to the revitalization of indigenous languages on internet is that they're very original in the sense that it all depends on what we think that we can say about a certain topic. It's not a matter of doing something that's already been done, rather to say, this is what I think about this certain topic, which is something that we can do very well, because this is a topic that, the indigenous viewpoint is a topic that has often not been made very known. We have to nonetheless research whatever we do and make sure that we give different opinions and understand that we have to encompass the social, cultural, and economic facets as well, and make sure that all of these efforts are sustainable and that can continue in the long term. Based on my experience, I would like to say that it's important that we also have an aesthetic definition so that we have social discourses that can help us to transform, to help us to add to the conversation, to create a sense of empathy as well. Indigenous peoples, we have always known how to read and write and how to tell stories. We have a lot of texts, and we have a lot of way of writing them, from writing them, putting them in writing, putting them using audio, video, drawings. These are what are known as visual narratives. Artists or young adults, indigenous young people who are willing to work with these social media are visual narrators, visual storytellers who have a wealth of information available to them so that we can understand the best way to tell our stories. I think it would be good, though, for us to continue to learn and to be trained as to what else we can do, so we can think about the many things that we can do to reach our audiences. We shouldn't just focus on one way of doing things. If we get trained, we'll find new tools and new ways to be as expressive as possible in a transparent manner, to be able to transfer our knowledge, and also at the same time be careful of copyrights of our indigenous peoples and the rights that the property rights that they have, and understand how we can use this in the digital world of graphic content. I think for now, that's all I would say. Thank you very much, Isela, sorry. I think it's very much in agreement with what many of us have learned recently, in the sense that digital tools have helped us to publish our own materials, edit our own materials, and although there's still a long way to go, it has been very helpful for us to see that we have the right to have beautifully illustrated books, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to create all of those materials that we all aspire to, be they in whatever language. I would like to ask all of the people who are connected to please write down in the chat space where you're writing from. We have people from Opchuk, the state of Mexico, Paraguay, but we'd like to know where else you're connecting from, just to know who's participating in this conversation. Now I would like to introduce JC Firthhagen. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She's a young digital activist for the Gwich'in language, and for a while now, she's been working with social media tools in order to promote a language that is also endangered. You are a young woman, JC, who has been acknowledged for your work on social media with your program that is known as Speak Which In to Me, hashtag Speak Which In to Me. And you've been making your language much more visible, as well as increasing the ways in which your language can be taught and learned. So I was wondering if you could share with us, what are the main challenges in using social media to promote the use of indigenous languages, and what is the main constraint that you've noticed during your work?
Hi, Cho. Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm going to start off in my language. Banguinzi Sitcha Nai, Shi, Saksal, JC Firthhagen, and Ubik Intl, Jinji Jukucha, Kuchen, Chansat, Tatlet, Kuchen, Shikonli. Good morning, my friends. My name is Saksal, or Little Martin, JC Firthhagen. I am born and raised in Inuvik, Northwest Territories, Canada, and I'm a proud Dinji Jukucha and Tatlet Kuchen woman. My indigenous language and my language is Gwich'in, or Dinji Juginjik, or Gwich'in, Ginjik, Dinji Jukyu, many names. I am the creator of the social media initiative, the Gwich'in Language Revival Campaign, #SpeakGwich'inToMe, which can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and SoundCloud by following the hashtag. And just like to start off a little bit, talking a little bit about my language. There are less than 500 speakers mostly over the age of 65 years old. The amount of Gutchen that still speak the language stands at around 0.5% of like there over being like 5,000 Gutchen. We don't have like the exact statistics of how many speakers we still have. And yeah, so I introduced myself and talked a little bit about my campaign on social media. And I'll go into some of the challenges that I've seen personally in doing this work. So the first thing that came to mind for me for a challenge was generating interest. I see that like in this day and age, 2020, the 21st century, how does one sit down to learn their Indigenous language, their language, especially in a pandemic, COVID-19? Like sometimes and oftentimes, I know in my nation, like the language can kind of be like set on the side burner when it comes to things like finances, trying to make a living. As an example, in the 90s, Gutchen were trying to settle their land claim. So the Gutchen language wasn't like a top priority, but that's changing now, thankfully. Our peoples have always fought so hard for language. And so when it comes to generating interest, when kids are on Facebook, they're playing outside, they're traveling, they're in school, post-secondary school, how do we generate interest to learn our languages and to keep our Indigenous languages strong and being spoken? And another thing, and that's like, that was the inspiration behind hashtag Speak Gutchen to me for short. One of the inspirations was, how do I make my language accessible to showcase the fact that if my language isn't being spoken, it's not being carried on, how is it gonna be sustainable? How are we gonna keep our language alive? And so that was so therefore I became invested in digital language revitalization. And another thing is maintaining interest. When that fire has been lit and someone wants to learn, our youth, our community members, how do we maintain their interest? It's so easy to become discouraged, especially if a member of our nation or peoples are living outside of their traditional territory, their homelands. How do we how do they find out how to learn their language if they don't have connections to who they are? I'll just use my my own peoples as Gutchen as an example. If they moved away, how do they reach out to elders, to community members, to fluent speakers? And in my language, if there's less than 500 speakers, and how do you find those if you aren't directly in community? And if like I'm very fortunate to have been able to grow up in my language, my own community, but I was also very shy, and like I'm not into calling people and visiting people out of the blue to learn, and that can be a barrier for myself and to many others. So I find that it can be really easy to be discouraged. Like as an example for myself, I'm sharing what I've seen and what I've been dealing with. And for other youth and peoples involved in getting into digital language activism and learning their language is like, yeah, it can be lonely, it can be isolating, it's so hard, it's making the time, it's dedicating yourself into learning your language. And for example, when I started, I've been doing this for 5 years now. I'm 26. I've been doing it since around 21 years old. I find that I can always be like getting so much attention in my work. Sometimes for months I'm busy posting, answering questions, or for a couple months like I'm not doing anything. So it can like easily go stagnant. It's kind of like a cycle, but that's okay. I'm used to it now. But for someone that's interested and in the movement, that can be something. And there can be a lack of resources to learn, as I've mentioned, and the lack of education in regards to growing my platform. Like for myself, I'm kind of running out of time, but like I don't know how to build a website, access funding, run a business. So that's for something for me to learn, and that I didn't anticipate when I first started this work. So my main points are generating interest in language revitalization, maintaining interest, keeping up encouragement, like our elders or someone may say you're not speaking correctly, but there's good and bad and like feedback to help you grow better. Thank you, Haicho.
Gracias, JC.
Thank you, JC.
Yo creo que algo que queda muy evidente y que también ha sido parte de los espacios.
Something that is evident and that many of you have mentioned is that sometimes digital activists and digital activism for indigenous languages can be a very lonely job, which is why this type of space is so important for us to get to know each other, to be able to explain what efforts we've been making and to explain what type of tools we've been using and that have been useful to us. Before I grant the floor to Henner, who will be telling us more about this, I would like to welcome the people who have joined us from El Salvador, Tabasco, San Luis Potosí, Sabanilla, Oaxaca, Toronto, Trinidad and Tobago, Mexico City, Manitoba, Yucatan, Juchitán, Chiapas, the UK, the Mezquital, and all of the other people who I have forgotten to mention. So please just introduce yourselves in the chat room so that the panelists can know who they're talking to. We already have a few questions in the Q&A box. If you ever want to, if the panelists would like to take a look at the questions, just to get an idea of what they're about, that would be great. I would like to introduce Henner. He's an assistant professor at Leiden University, and he is a digital activist for the Mayan language. Henner is a person who has been following this topic for many years now, formally, and he's learned a lot about what people involved in this field do and what type of tools we can use to encourage the use of our languages. And I understand that he's part of a work team that is developing a toolkit for digital activism together with UNESCO. And it's based on research that was conducted over a period of years and based on the experience of digital activists in Latin America. Henner, could you please tell us a little bit about the toolkit that you are going to refer to? Your mic, could you please turn on your mic? He's speaking his language. Thank you very much, Taheo. He's speaking his language. I hope you are all well. I'm pleased to be here with you today. The project that we're working on together with Eddie Avila from Rising of Voices and other colleagues that I hope will join us is set up to act as a benchmark, as a resource for activists working in their own languages, in their different indigenous contexts, and that require the use of digital tools. And although we're still in the process of configuring everything for the toolkit, the idea is that this toolkit have different compartments, let's say, in which the activists, the digital activists, the indigenous digital activists will be able to select those tools that work for them and that are helpful to them so that they can do their job more efficiently, so that they can promote the use of indigenous languages more efficiently. Based on my own experience, most of the cases that we've been working on have been for Latin America, basically with the work that we have to do with Spanish. But we know that there are many ways in which we can teach indigenous languages in all of our continents, be it in North America with our brothers and sisters from the Canadian First Nations, or our brothers and sisters from the indigenous communities in the US. And so if they are ever interested in helping us out with the toolkit, we'd be happy to have their collaboration. And we've also been working with the possibility of talking to African communities as well as with Southeastern Asia. If anybody is interested, we'd be happy to work with them. We're trying to configure that type of input as well. One of the things that we're doing with the toolkit is to identify interesting practices, inspiring practices that can help with sustainability in teaching indigenous languages when using digital means. This toolkit, therefore, would have these compartments, let's say, that you could take advantage of, as well as suggestions so that you can analyze the situation. As Isela said, that way you can analyze your projects, analyze what you're doing, and determine what would be best for individuals, what would be best for community groups, and so on, and possibly even to see what you could do in public contexts, such as universities or friendship houses or municipal governments, for example. The instrument proposes not just the use of technological tools, which is perhaps the most appealing at this point in time, but also things that are easily adapted by indigenous language speakers in rural communities. It will also include tools that could be used by indigenous language speakers in rural as well as urban areas. We have not just considered the use of social media, but also considered the use of practical things that can be provided to teams when, for example, as is often the case, internet connections are not exactly very reliable. Yesterday, for example, we had issues with a virtual forum in which I was participating with these technologies, which are very promising, but we would often have problems with the connection, with the internet connection. So there are a lot of very creative ways in which indigenous groups and indigenous individuals are finding ways to overcome their limitations. And although it's not ideal to have these types of limitations, that the creativity of our indigenous groups is seen in the way in which we find to overcome all of these problems. And that's very inspiring. It's also a way to contribute. It's an indigenous contribution to the use of technology. We know that we need more digital literacy, as you've all heard, but it's also true that the indigenous peoples have found ways to overcome their problems. They're finding practical solutions, innovative solutions to all of these challenges. So that's something else that we hope to do. The toolkit would also include planning elements, as I already referred to. For example, the importance of understanding the available infrastructure, how you can use available media, the establishment of strategic partnerships, which is something that somebody else already referred to, and the importance of visualizing the possible participation of the public. JC referred to the fact that there are individuals who are interested in encouraging the use of indigenous languages, but we also have to find a way to help them not feel worn out and tired. It's also important to find a way to deal with that and to explain how all of us can delegate perhaps some of our activities. And that's something that we hope to include in our toolkit as well. Ideally, in any type of initiative of this type, we should try to encourage the possibility of using our right to express ourselves in our indigenous languages, not just for the cultural expressions, but also because of the need to have quality services, to have informed public policies based on what we need, as well as the right to take part in the public decisions that are being reached for our own purposes. Another toolkit compartment would be the legal side of everything, how we can legally encourage the use of our languages and to have a better understanding of what should be done and what we should require from the authorities in each one of our countries. All of these efforts also have a very touchy subject, which is how to evaluate the impact, because everything we do has an impact, and that is something that is always subject to discussion. And so this toolkit will include that element, not so much as in the sense of it will not be providing a recipe of things that can be done all over the world in this exact same manner, rather to find a series of flexible mechanisms or different techniques that can be used to be able to follow up on the multiple impact that our efforts might have, because sometimes those effects might be invisible. So we have to find a way to measure all of that. And the way in which we hope to explain to people what we're doing is to take advantage of the internet. We will probably also be finding ways to creating analog kits, print kits, let's say, hard copy kits at a low cost, but no, not low quality, in order to make sure that the tools can reach as many people as possible all over the world for the people who really want it. And of course, something else that would be very interesting would be for us to incorporate the talent of all of the activists, indigenous activists, in all of these digital efforts in order to make sure that we are communicating their work as well as the suggestions and strategies that they can use, and that will be included in this toolkit. So hopefully we will be able to use these digital networks as much as possible with the collaboration and the interest of everybody, of those who are already working on this and who want to improve their digital production. Thank you, Henner. And something that is very clear from all of the comments we've heard so far is that we need interest, but not just interest, nor just good intentions on the part of the state, but also investments must be made. We have to be able to count on clear budgets that will be channeled directly to the initiatives and to the projects, so these projects can actually work and have an actual impact on our communities. And that also has a lot to do with this right that we have to free determination and to autonomy for all of our communities, so that we can decide upon our future and our lives. And that also has a lot to do with the respect for their territories and the respect for our lands, and to be able to live in our lands and not be pushed out of our lands because of extractive projects or because of threats to our environment. So that's something that is very closely related to the language. The languages are our speakers, and our speakers are dying off. As Yasnaya mentioned, our languages don't just die, they're oftentimes killed, which is why it's important that we highlight the fact that, as Irma Pineda, who is a indigenous delegate and a poet who works with the UN, she said, we don't believe that we don't want this Los Pinos Declaration to just be a list of good intentions. We want it to become concrete, specific actions. And in that sense, they thought to create or to organize this panel. And I have the next question, which is aimed at everybody, and each one of you please tell us your own perspective. Let's begin with Isela, then JC, then Henner, and then Ian goes last. And the question is, how do you think your work and indigenous language, digital activism in general can contribute to make sure that the decade of Indigenous languages will have a positive impact on the quality of the speaking of Indigenous languages all over the world, specifically Mexico and Canada? And what concrete recommendations do you think should be made for us to consider in these few months prior to the decade starting so that digital activism can have more of an impact? I think I forgot to mention in my previous comments what I do, and perhaps I should answer or explain what I do. I do editorial work, graphic editorial work based on the Nahua culture of my community. It's an indigenous region here in Mexico City. And I basically wanted to explore visual storytelling. I don't think that we as indigenous peoples only use poetry or storytelling. We also use graphic storytelling, and I wanted to highlight the importance of that. And what I do is, for the past 10 years, I started with this idea of, I mean, it all started with the fact that I never saw my story, my culture, my language being reflected in any content, any graphic content, be it in print, hard copy, on the internet, in the movies, on TV, radio. I never saw my face, my voice anywhere. In my community, it would seem that I wasn't as important. I wasn't important enough to be in a book, in a story, to be part of anything. And so I do these illustrations. I work with animation. I'm somewhat familiar with the animation side of illustration. And in my community, I I believe that I am somebody who is learning. Although I'm an indigenous person, I'm somebody who is barely learning to speak her language. And I thought, if I had learned this language from the very beginning when I was a child, and if I had learned about all of these things that the Mexican government strategically disappeared from my knowledge, things would be different. And so I thought that in the future, that shouldn't be taking place, and that it's us, the young people, who have to find a way to overcome things, because a lot of that information that we used to have has been lost, it has been censored, it has been eliminated. And so that's why I began this project, in which I wanted to bring back our language and to have an impact on a generation of young people in my community who no longer speak the language, who no longer recall the oral traditions, who no longer live off of the land. And I was wondering, how could I go about making sure that these new generations, which have been bombarded and influenced by so many other things, to find a way to embrace their culture, to look at it with pride and to say, oh yes, that's what I am, and I like to be that. And so what my strategy was to break away from stereotypes, perhaps more so those related to indigenous involvement in the graphic world, because I've learned over the years how the indigenous peoples have been represented in books, in movies, in cartoons, and it's been terrible. And all of those views, the way they look at things, have been from the outside looking in. That is to say, nobody from our own indigenous peoples have done anything in that regard. We hadn't created our own version of ourselves. We hadn't represented ourselves. We hadn't had our own content. We hadn't been doing it. It would seem something so simple to do, and all of a sudden I realized we don't have that. We don't have it in my community, so I can do that because I studied that. I studied to be an illustrator. I'm a specialist in that. I'm an expert in visual narrative. And so I started to work on that. And then all of that led me to the language, and that I had to learn my language, study it, and I had to get involved with the community with which I wanted to communicate. And so in that sense, digital activists are going to play a very important role, because they use exhaustive and creative use of the tools that are available to us. Also because we're looking for graphic and artistic criteria in which we use our language and our culture. This is something that is done with a political position. It's a political positioning. It's not something that we're doing just because it's in Spanish or because it's pretty or because they gave me a scholarship or something. I'm doing this because my voice and the voice of a lot of indigenous peoples is not being heard. We don't have the same rights as everybody else. We don't have the same education. For example, in my case, I studied design and arts in Mexico, which is a country which is extremely wealthy in narratives and in graphics. In the design school at my university, we had no subject dealing with indigenous art and design. To put it, just to make you understand how difficult the situation is. They were completely eliminating our ancient knowledge. If our young indigenous people go to those public universities, public schools, to find a way to earn a living with all of that wealth they have behind them, but then they come to the university where they focus exclusively on creating skilled workers, and they don't tell them that their culture is important and that they can contribute because they have important things to say, we would find ourselves in a terrible situation. And so I would say that digital activism helps us to see all of those gaps that we have. It shows that they've made us invisible, that they've thrown us from the frame, and they've wanted to eliminate our culture. So getting back to the question, oh yes, I think that digital activists, when I decided that I was going to do this because I wanted to do this, and I've been doing this for years now, I can say that don't lose your excitement, because I assure you there are more and more people involved in this as the years go by, and it's logical, and there's an enormous future here. I understand that belonging, the sense of belonging through these types of content will increase, and it's very important that we not throw in the towel, that we always continue with our efforts. Activists are simply mediators, somebody who helps to bring people together, people who want to express themselves and people who want to hear others expressing themselves. That's because there's an audience that hadn't been reflected in the past. They were in small niches, but they've found an identity for themselves, and people are realizing that they can learn from others and that they have a right. And so this is, those of us who are activists, who are involved in all of this, we're all committed, we're engaged with this whole idea of representing the audience. And so we are representatives of the audience and of the indigenous people. And it's a political position. It's not just something that's in vogue or fashionable. And I mention this because there's a trend right now in illustration and in book publishing, which I think is going to change in the future, because we have to, there's a lot of trends going on. A lot of artists, editors, filmmakers, content producers that are not indigenous are going to supposedly, quote unquote, inspire themselves by in indigenous languages to create characters, cartoon characters, and so on from their point of view. Is that right? I mean, I can't say that it shouldn't be done. It might help us to become more visible, but remember that it would be best for us to do it from our own point of view. Remember that as activists, we have a political position. We're not doing this just for the sake of doing it for the sake of fashion, which is what the Mexican government often does. The Mexican government has been responsible for almost 90% of editorial content in Mexico, and 80%, because 80% of the products are bought by the government, the state. So the state decides what is published for what audience and so on. Even for the indigenous peoples, indigenous peoples read and write are based on what the state says. they believe that they should hear more about the Little Prince or that type of character more than an Indigenous character. But that's not what we need as Indigenous peoples. We need to hear our own stories being reflected in books and in their own languages. My recommendations, I have a lot of recommendations and I don't know if I have enough time. Taheo, do I have enough time? Well, could you just give us two really quickly to conclude, and then in the final round, you can round those thoughts out? Well, the first recommendation would be something that Hen had already mentioned, which is that you have to analyze, research, work with all of the resources available to you. Use your creativity to use all of the tools available to you, and even those that aren't available to you. Exploit all of those tools as much as possible. Find models for internal validation. Don't just wait for the state or for who knows what institution to award us with something or to acknowledge us. We have to validate ourselves. And also, another proposal would be to design an educational program for digital artists, focus on the design and production of visual narratives that goes from the creation of characters to the entire business, because that's part of the economic sustainability facet as well, because you need money for all of this. And so far, it hasn't been very profitable. It's not like we want to become rich, but we have a right to have all of this. We pay researchers for researching authors from all over the world, but they don't pay for this type of work, this type of research taking place for us. At least I haven't heard that much about that happening. And to the universities, I would like to ask them to become spaces that allow us to imagine new alternatives and to put them into practice, that they become spaces that they accompany us in these projects by providing us with training, consultancy, access to hardware and software, internet, that they include in their curriculum the design of Indigenous arts, that they also give us the possibility of thinking about creating content for the public in general, not for specialists, not just for specialists, and also to give us scholarships and grants and prioritize Indigenous peoples, and it not just be the same people that have done it in the past. That's it. Thank you. Thank you, Isela. I think you were very clear, so that people don't complain afterwards, oh, you never make any proposals, you never tell us about how we can help. You've given us very clear path that we can go on to take these specific actions. And these are proposals that can become public policies. We don't have to wait 18 months for something to happen, because our languages are slowly dying off and the speakers of our languages are dying. And so it's good for us to design things, but in the prior months, we should also start to work. JC, I'll repeat the question for you. How do you think your job and Indigenous languages, digital activism can contribute to make sure that the next decade will actually have an impact on the vitality of our Indigenous languages? And what recommendations would you make for us to prepare for that decade of Indigenous languages over the next few months that we still have before it begins?
Yes, thank you. I would like to share some of the work that I do with hashtag #SpeakWhichendemy on social media regarding digital language revitalization. It's been spoken before in this panel, making our languages accessible and making them visible. I'm not saying that digital language revitalization is the only way to go with language revitalization. I wholeheartedly believe in language classes, other modes of learning. This is something that I'm going to mention later, that a language revitalization, there isn't only one way to do it. But with hashtag #SpeakWhichendemy, which was inspired by hashtag #SpeakSami to me, Sami Youth Initiative by the Sami Youth Council in Sápmi, also known as Northern Europe or Scandinavia, which I was inspired by. They showed me how to do the work that I do with hashtag Speak What's Into Me. And for an example, I could take a picture of the wall or of the stars, which is sun in my language, or Jidi Dagai, white, and then I would upload it on social media, editing it with a free photo editor on my phone, for an example, or a free app. And we've talked about how technology can be expensive and not accessible to many. And but just upload it using your own hashtag. I encourage everyone and anyone to create their own hashtag Speak My Language to Me, and that can be easily bringing up your language and the work that you do and the work by others that they can also contribute on social media. And I always share how I do this work. I think showing people how to do this work and supporting them. There's very many language movements like similar to my own now that I've been able to inspire and support. And I've mentioned before that support, it can be hard, especially when it comes to like capacity. And I'm only one person, and so there's like hashtag Speak Northern Shoshone to me, in Yukon, Canada, hashtag Speak, excuse me, pronouncing Inupiaqtun to me in Alaska. And I've been told it's a positive movement, and it's good to see positivity on social media, especially when it comes to like our own peoples doing this work and sharing it with our community, our youth, our elders. And I'll move on to some of my concrete recommendations, and I may come back to what I've been talking about. So what I was thinking about for recommendations: work with community members, Indigenous peoples, and local peoples when it comes to the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. Like, I'm just gonna say, like, I don't want to see people that aren't from our communities deciding things for us as to what language revitalization should be or what it looks like. Because I can say that wholeheartedly, as I mentioned before, every single community in regards to language revitalization will have different issues. There's not one way to revitalize our languages. To listen to our peoples, our communities, our Indigenous peoples, and pay people what they're worth, especially our elders. Our people's time and knowledge is priceless. Our language speakers have been underpaid for decades. Make it so we can make our livelihoods for language revitalization. Make it so our elders can make a proper living, and our language speakers on sharing our language and our knowledge. And to stop underfunding Indigenous languages. I can share in Canada, the amount of funding that Indigenous languages get compared to the French language is astronomical. There's so much more resources and funding out there for like the French language and their schools than it is for our Indigenous languages. And to support Indigenous language revitalization efforts and movements, support Indigenous language classes, languages in schools, online and in person. It's been mentioned before, support our activists, support people in the language, their ideas, and to start recognizing the existence of our Indigenous languages, peoples, and lands. I challenge Canada and Mexico and all of our countries to recognize our existence. I know that I'm not the only one thinking of our Indigenous languages and peoples that have been pushed aside and ignored, such as the Papachaise Indigenous peoples around Edmonton, Alberta. Thank you so much.
Thank you, JC. Janet, your recommendations? Thank you, Taheo. I think that several of the points that Shospa referred to are things I would agree with. Isela Shospa referred to are things I would agree with. I agree that we have to make sure that our institutions in my country, in Mexico, for example, open up a lot more to our efforts. But there's also something very important that we have to do as speakers, as active or passive speakers, which is to talk, for us to talk, to use our languages in as many spaces as possible, in as many places as possible. Because of my work as a researcher and a professor, one of the things that I've been trying to do and trying to understand is what changes when a language starts to be used in digital media. And surprisingly, I've seen that usually things don't change. I'm not saying that our efforts to be innovative with our digital platforms hasn't borne any fruit. Rather, that we also have to create communities. We have to translate the way we do things in the real world into the digital world. I think that that would be one way for us to own these digital networks. And this is not something that just indigenous peoples are doing, but also different types of communities are doing that from different historical and cultural viewpoints. Internet has a certain design, and that design is created for an ideal global citizen, which is usually somebody high class that lives in an urban community that has access to certain languages or certain ways of communicating. And the other communities, the different cultural groups, the different peoples in different regions of the world have to break down the internet and own it, but in a more collective fashion. And so one of the biggest trends we've seen in the use of digital tools is that we've seen that there's a lot of creativity. Isela mentioned that initially. There's an enormous number of proposals of what you can do in order to encourage the use of indigenous languages. But those proposals are oftentimes unable to find their communities. So I think that one of the things that we have to do is create networks, get to know each other, help each other, spark an interest, not just in our work as digital activists, which is obviously important, but also to build these communities in the digital world as well. And so I think that's one way in which we're going to be much more effective. I think that a lot of the recommendations have already been made by my colleagues. As JC said, it would also be good to be able to pay our collaborators, remunerate them for their efforts. It can't just be like part of an effort that is unpaid. We shouldn't be treated as second-class citizens because other languages are, when you learn another language, other types of languages, you're paid or you teach, you pay your teacher, but not for our languages. And so in this new decade, I think we should try to avoid these reproducing these administrative ways of handling things in the past. And lastly, I would insist on the fact that it's true that digital literacy is extremely important. We have to learn how to use media as effectively as possible, or tools as effectively as possible. But I'm always curious about finding out how peoples and indigenous peoples are subverting the use of these technologies, how they are making them more Nahuatl, how they are making them more Mayan, subverting in the sense that they're adapting it to their own needs. And so keep your eyes open and your ears open to see how other people are doing things which are totally different from how things have been done in the past in digital, but there are own ways of doing things. Thank you, Henner. And lastly, for the recommendations, Ian, could you, and by the way, I would just like to first say something before you begin, Ian. This pandemic, at least here in Mexico, has forced us to take steps quickly, that things that have to be done immediately in terms of education. So in that sense, Ian, since you have so much experience in that field, what recommendations would you make, bearing in mind not just the current situation, but also what we can do with indigenous languages and the teaching of those languages? What should we do in order to teach people and to educate people, and what to do with the platforms that are used for teaching indigenous languages?
I think I was remiss in that I didn't mention what I do for a daytime job outside of language. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto studying Indigenous language revitalization, but I also work within Indigenous education in Ontario, K to 12. And I can sympathize with my panelists in that we have an expression on my community that we run language for $5. We can make $5 stretch a long way, and that's not the way to do things. And people need to be paid. Echoing the sentiments that Canada has 2 official languages, and my children can go to school and receive material in the French language that far exceeds what my small community can produce in terms of language materials to support the Munsee language. When I was younger, the language was very visible on my community, and then it disappeared in the 1990s. And then when I came back to the language in the late 90s, there was the prevailing opinion that language wasn't important any longer. I do want to stress the fact that through digital activism, and in terms of offering programming online, that the language does have to originate and respect from where it came from. So when I work with the Munsee language, I'm respectful that it does come from a land base, the Munsee Delaware community. I'm mindful that visibility is critical, especially I'm middle-aged, I'm 48, and that to entice the younger generation to learn the Munsee language, that it needs to be visible. And I can't wait. I can't wait for government policy to come to my rescue and promote the language itself, or I can't allow the province will step in and announce that my language is going to be as important as English and French. Therefore, taking initiative and encouraging others to, access media outlets, to access museums. We have translated material for Canadian museums. We have actively included translations of the Munsee language through major media outlets here in Ontario and through the CBC. But it's kind of being that bee in the bonnet, that agitator, where I can't wait, and the people who speak the language in my community can't wait. Then therefore we have to take the initiative to make it visible and important, and therefore the younger generation that we're hoping to support will see the viability of the language. Part of that is to include new words, because we have very few speakers. Our new words need to catch up with the rest of the world. So to translate the word Zoom or to translate the word internet is very time consuming, but these are things that the younger generation are going to want to know. Also, being that strong advocate and voice to have Indigenous languages have that same importance as both English and French within the the local school curriculums that would support our students, but also provincially and nationally. That's my hope, and that's my sort of activism with what I do on Twitter, as well with offering the classes off of Zoom. It's that spark that I want that younger generation to be able to take my place when I can no longer do this, and that they don't have to work for $5, and that the Munsee language is as important as English and French and other Indigenous languages here in Canada. One of my recommendations would be that the best practice, that there's a mode of sharing best practice. I've learned so many different avenues strictly by being part of this presentation today, that I'm going to go and explore using the new apps, TikTok or whatnot, to engage the younger generations or to engage all ages of learners. Being considerate of all community members, that for most of us, we don't live on on our community. We're not able to, so that we have to consider the fact that we're trying to reach all learners, both in Canada, United States, Mexico, wherever they may be, they're coming in to learn the language. Access to technology and internet is critical in terms of the work that we do, and I'd be remiss that I myself don't have the very best internet in the world, and that a lot of my students who attend through Zoom live on community and the internet connections are poor. We need to hold governments accountable. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was yet another document that Canadian government finalized, but have not been at all fast in terms of implementing, at least with reference to languages 62 and 63, recommendations to maintain and promote Indigenous languages. You need care and respect in the process of learning culture and language, that we're all coming at it from a different, a different ability, and we all have our different perspectives on the language, but trying to develop that care and respect in our community of learners. And as well, coming back to supporting the network. So taking away that isolation, I think that JC mentioned, that we're not working, and I think Isabella mentioned it as well, that we work in isolation, but taking away that would be a recommendation that I would highly recommend, simply because the learning, as I said before, the learning that I have done today, I'm taking away, and I will definitely take some time over the next couple of weeks to try and see if that would be something that I could apply to the Munsee language, or I'm going to reach out to my panelists for ideas. And lastly, we need language equity and visibility. We need to fight the fight and make sure that the Indigenous languages are equal to the ones that get the primary attention within our countries, and to maintain that visibility. So to keep it forefront, that people will not forget that that our languages are just as important as the mainstream languages that are spoken. I think that's it. Anishik.
Thank you, Ian. I think that you've all been very clear as to your very specific proposals. We all want quality internet. We can't wait until the decade begins, although it will soon begin, but all governments and all of our institutions should play an important role in what we're going to be doing, because part of what we're doing is something that, if it's not focused on the Indigenous speakers communities, it's for naught. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but this has been a wonderful opportunity to get to know each other, get to know about your paths you've been taking, and possible paths for the rest of us in the future. We're going to conclude really quickly. I'll give you just less than 1 minute to say a few final words of any comment you would like to make, a very quick round. If you'd like, we'll begin with Henner, then JC, then Ian, and then Isela Shospa at the very end. Less than 1 minute, please, because we've run out of time, but it's been wonderful to share this panel session with you. Thank you. Who do you want to begin, JC or me? You, Henner, I apologize. He's speaking his language, Mayan. Thank you very much to all of the participants in this panel session, because your ideas and your contributions hopefully will be able to help us with this toolkit that we are going to be creating. We know that it won't be the panacea, it won't be the final word, but hopefully, with any luck, this is going to be a wonderful opportunity for us to revitalize all of our efforts and to create this network that will help us throughout our entire continent with all of our communities. And hopefully, this decade will become an opportunity for us to meet again and to revive all of our languages. Thank you. JC?
Hi Cho, Masi Cho, thank you. Hi Drew Shonihli, my heart is happy. To our panelists, to our audience, and everyone here today. Thank you so much. I've learned so much. I really love this panel and being a part of it. I'm so grateful. And Van Guinzi, Shilakat, Crystal Frank, Chansat, Jade English, my Gutchin friends from Alaska and Inuvik, where I'm from. Take care, Adikin Yanti, Nitiveko Zoo, everyone. Good luck on your path.
Thank you. Ian, your final words?
Anishik Wamawan Lapich Kanawalomwa. I wanted to say thank you to my fellow panelists. I've learned a lot today. I also really do appreciate the opportunity to sort of provide perspective on my language, on a language that I feel very passionate about. And I love the passion that I've heard today. I go away feeling very strong. Anishik.
Thank you, Ian. Isela? Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you. Thank you for letting me be a part of the panel. Thank you to all of my friends that heard and listened to us and who have shared their information. And well, I agree with many of you in the sense that we have to create a community, get to know each other, back each other, be there, create support networks, and above all, to all of those who are starting on this path or who are already on this path, as Kenneth was saying, dare to challenge the apparently unmovable cultural process that has been taking place in the past. Challenge them. That's the whole point. Try to create a narrative that goes against the past, where creativity has been exploited. That's something that we indigenous communities can do. We've always been able to create stories, to tell stories. In Mexico, it's very easy to do it. You can use your creativity in your tamal, in your clothing. Everything that we do as indigenous communities tell a story. They're saying something. Challenge, go ahead, challenge everything that already exists. Do it any way you want, any way you can, because you have the authority of being from a First Nation. Thank you. She's speaking in her own language. Thank you to Teresa for the interpreter, for having been the means so that all of us could be able to communicate with each other. I would also like to say that if you're interested in the subject, that you follow us on the Raising Voices social media, as well as ACT. In August, we'll have more activities. Thank you for listening in. She's speaking her language. See you again soon, and hopefully this will be the first of many, many conversations that we'll have between the nations of our two countries.